Good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to see so many of you here this evening. I think Tiffany is our equivalent of Impressionism, and there is never any dearth of an audience, and there's always still so much to learn, and it always gives us, at least me, and I think many, many other people, so much happiness and cheerfulness, which is a good thing right now. And I hope you all had an opportunity to go up to the second floor to see the Cooper Hewitt's teak room before this program tonight, because it is really looking the most splendid I think it has ever looked, and I think it's so befitting that the Tiffany pieces are the same time period, contemporary with the mansion and Lockwood de Forest, so it's really, it all just sings so beautifully. I'm Kara McCarty. I'm the curatorial director of Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum, and I'd love to welcome you to this 5th season of the Enid and Lester Morse Historic Design Lecture Series, which was a brainchild of Denny Morse several years ago when the museum embarked on its major renovation. And Denny, being the stalwart champion of keeping our collections alive, came up with the idea of having this lecture series that really focused the spotlight on the museum's collections, specifically its historic collections, and to bring in, she had this wonderful idea to bring in experts from various parts of the world to talk about our collection in ways that we might not normally look at it. And we've had the most wonderful roster of speakers. I recognize some faces out there, so I know some of you have been to some of them. But it's been such a joy to share the collection with our visitors this way, as well as for the curators to get to know some new colleagues. So on behalf of Cooper Hewitt and our audience, Denny and Lester, heartfelt thanks to your continuing generosity and support of the museum, not only the collections, but many, many things that Cooper Hewitt continues to do. The title of tonight's talk is Louis Comfort Tiffany, Artist and Innovator. Our speaker, Benjamin Macklowe, joined Macklowe Gallery in 1994 and became the 3rd generation president in 2012. Under his leadership, Macklowe Gallery became the world's most respected dealer of antique and estate jewelry, French Art Nouveau decorative arts, and the entire oeuvre of Louis Comfort Tiffany. A sought-after expert, Mr. Macklowe has appeared on television to discuss Tiffany lamps and Martha Stewart, lectured on Louis Comfort Tiffany, and presented the art glass of Émile Gallé. He has helped expand the decorative arts collections of major museums in the United States and abroad, and he has been a very generous and instrumental lender to exhibitions. On the Cooper Hewitt front, Mr. Macklowe has kindly lent us, for an extended period of time, a sumptuous Tiffany Turtleback Chandelier, which is currently on view in the Tiffany exhibition in our 2nd floor Lockwood de Forest design teak room, which was originally the Andrew Carnegie Family Library. The glow of the lamp's dense golden and modulated glass panels harmonizes with the golden and red stenciling that de Forest designed for the walls, completing the glowing effect intended by de Forest. Carnegie, too, had a similar chandelier in the room, so to see the lamp now on view in the type of context for which it was originally tended is a very special opportunity, and it would be a dream if it could end up there. End of year. The exhibition Passion for the Exotic, Louis Comfort Tiffany and Lockwood de Forest is made possible in part by the Richard H. Driehaus Foundation. Restoration of the magnificent teak room was supported in part by the American Express Historic Preservation Fund. Please welcome Benjamin Macklowe.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for that very kind introduction, and thank you very much, Mr. and Mrs. Morse, for making this possible. Before we start, can everybody just be absolutely certain that their phones are off? not just silenced but off. I tend to get very distracted, and we're live streaming tonight, and I could end up spouting some sort of awful thing if that happens, and then he'll never invite me back. All right, so as the title indicates, my goal tonight is for you to get a sense, sort of a 10,000-foot view of Louis Comfort Tiffany's life and why he was considered such an important person during his life, what he sought to achieve, and what his lasting effects are. It's not nearly possible in 45 minutes to cover everything, so by virtue of it, there are going to be things that are omitted. I'm just going to say I'm sorry now. If you invite me back, we could talk about other things. But let's try to go through it in a way that gives you a lot to learn from and a lot of enjoyment. So of course the first question is, who was this guy? Who was Louis Comfort Tiffany? Well, the best way to think of him is really the merchant prince of New York. His father, Charles Louis Tiffany, in 1837, founded Tiffany Day and Young, which eventually became Tiffany and Company, the foremost purveyor of silver, stationery, exotic goods, and of course fine jewelry in New York City. This is a picture from 1870 of their second store, which was on Union Square. So if you actually look in the window of the store from then, you're going to see exotica. This is not what you would think of when you think of Tiffany and Company today, but we have German bronzes, we have Japanese fans, we have crystal from England, and then of course we have jewelry mainly from the continent, most of which was imported from Italy and England in this period. So it gives you a sense of what it would have been like if you'd been in this world that he grew up in. And the company, Tiffany and Company, really started to assert its power in the world after the Civil War and in this period, and this is when he was growing up, because of course he was born in 1848. So when he was 22, this is what the window would have looked like in his daddy's store. And when he was a little bit older, this is what the display in his daddy's store would have looked like at the 1889 World's Fair in Paris. Now we think now of World's Fairs as something sort of a bygone era, but you have to understand that in this period, starting with the Crystal Palace exhibition in 1853, the World's Fairs is where everybody went to see what was new. And everybody went to see what was coming and who was going to be the power going forward. And so Tiffany and Company took this enormous stand, and if you look carefully, by then they already had stores in New York, London, and Paris. Gives you an idea that they were already an international firm searching for global supremacy. Now, Tiffany himself had nothing to do with his father's business at this time. This is what Mr. Tiffany was doing. This is a painting in 1872, so we're going back in time a little, of a view of Cairo. And this is not something he reproduced from a photo. This is something that he did from visiting Egypt and all parts of the Middle East, mostly with George Inness, a watercolorist that he studied with at the National Academy of Design, just down the street. And it really shows his understanding of nuance and color and his love for the exotic and his sort of heterogeneous point of view. I always think of Tiffany as an aesthetic omnivore. He just took whatever he thought was special and turned it into a whole. And when you see his studio in the 1880s, it gives you a sense of that. Here we have in an etching by Thomas Moran, what Tiffany lived with, and he had Persian carpets, and he had European busts, and a Chinese vase, and a American clock. And so all of this was not just things he thought were pretty, but they were things that actually inspired him. But his real love as a collector, which greatly informed who he became as an artist, was really more in the Far East. And this is a picture from Laurelton Hall, which was his great private home on Long Island, which shows his collection of Japanese art and artifacts, samurai armor across the wall, tsuba and sword guards across the top, and furniture as well there. And so it sort of shows a lot of what he did, and you're going to get a sense of Laurelton Hall as this Gesamtkunstwerk, which is a fancy German word for an entire sort of complete work of art. We have Richard Wagner to thank for that. And Laurelton Hall, if it existed today, with its 570 acres of landscaped gardens and its 8 stories entirely designed by Mr. Tiffany himself, would probably be the most important non-presidential historic home in America. Unfortunately, all that exists of it now are what we have in the various museums. But let's talk about that. In the Metropolitan Museum, we actually have the loggia from Laurelton Hall. So if you go to the Met, you probably have seen this, but what I think is just so fantastic when you build on this concept of the aesthetic omnivore is we have this sort of Greco-Roman, Egyptian-inspired design, because if we go through it here, we have Roman mosaic. They're not Roman, they're Tiffany glass, but Roman-inspired mosaic, stylized Corinthian capitals with a Near Eastern floral motif, and then as we go farther down it, you'll see that the actual column structure is entirely Egyptian. So what do we really have here? We have Tiffany windows and lamps that reflect the Japanese aesthetic and the idea of geometry. All of this somehow works together in harmony. And what I love about this period in time and Mr. Tiffany's interpretation and love of it was that there was not one idea of beauty. There was not one idea of what was correct. And he was not afraid of putting things together that nobody else had put together before, because he was really not afraid of being mocked. And we don't think of it now, but actually the most severe documented human fear after the fear of being murdered is the fear of being humiliated in public. And he just wasn't afraid of that, which I think is just fantastic, and it's really inspirational to me, and that's why I'm able to stand up here and speak to this crowd of strangers. So anyway, let's continue on. And so as we sort of think about Tiffany, I think it's important to understand that he was born into this extraordinarily wealthy family, and he grew up in the milieu of Lady Astor's 400. And he understood that in order for his artistic ideas to gain credence, they had to start at the top. So his first major artistic experience, his first major commission, was actually the Veterans Room at the 7th Regiment Armory, which is now called the Park Avenue Armory. And I've got some nodding heads. So a lot of you have probably seen this. Now I have to apologize, this is an old photo. It has since been restored and looks much better. But if you look at this and you see this extraordinary blue glass fireplace with, on the top here, sort of a scene of the preservation of the Union, because you have the eagle of the Union destroying the snake of the Confederacy. This was a place where the Silk Stocking Regiment came to trade stories after the Civil War. And I know we think of the silk stockings of the Havmeyers and the other wealthy New York families as sort of very, very privileged. But they were actually the first people to volunteer for the Union Army when the Confederacy fired on Fort Sumter. And this armory, which is the only privately funded armory in the United States, held a lot of great patriots. And after the war was over, they built this extraordinary room, and Tiffany did it for them in 1882, and that's where the veterans came to smoke cigars and drink brandy and trade stories. So it was an extraordinarily important place, and when Tiffany was trying to think about how to make it beautiful, he took ideas from his entire life experience. And so we have, as I said, this sort of Roman-inspired glass mosaic in the background, but then as you continue through, you actually have, backwards here, 1 second. You have stenciled Indian wood ceilings, silver stenciled, that he would have actually purchased in India with Lockwood DeForest. So it brings us full circle here to the museum, because there's no question that there was an involvement there. And the sort of materials of invention are continued with the stenciled leather walls, and then of course the very first example of Tiffany's windows. Now if you look at this for a second, there's nothing floral here, there's nothing ecclesiastical here. This is really a window that its job is to let the light in. And it's 20 years before Frank Lloyd Wright. Wow. Pretty incredible, right? So having sort of, if you will, conquered America's sort of gathering place of New York's elite, he got the commission to do the private home of Louisiana Henry Havmeyer. And so he thought if he could do this really well, then it would really set him up. So let's take a look at this. Now here again, we have the entire work of art created by Tiffany. So we have the first of Tiffany's lamps, for which he is so famous, but then we also have Asian wall coverings, we have Persian carpets, and then we have furniture that was designed by Tiffany and DeForest and carved in Ahmedabad, I think that's how it's pronounced, India, and imported. So again, we have this sort of extraordinary globalism at a time when most Americans had never traveled more than a few miles from their home. And the Havmeyers, who made their fortune in the sugar and oil industries, were only too happy to have this, and they had great faith in Tiffany. Unfortunately, this house was knocked down to build 1 East 66th Street. And so the Metropolitan Museum got many things from the Havmeyer family, and other things have sort of filtered out throughout the marketplace, but unfortunately this home no longer exists. Speaking of places that no longer exist, this no longer exists either. Can I get a show of hands of how many people who know what this is? 1, 2 out of 115. This was the White House. So it's sort of extraordinary because just a few years after doing the Armory, just a few years after doing the Havmeyer home, Louis Comfort Tiffany set his sights on the White House. And President Chester Arthur had him redo 3 rooms in the White House. They were extraordinarily respected in the period. They were written about in the period. Unfortunately, we only have black and white photos of it from the period. So fortunately, an artist in 2007, having read the descriptions of the colors in the room, did a rendition of it. So this really gives you a sense. This is Peter Waddell doing the Grand Illumination from 2007. It gives you a sense of how Tiffany was able to be so fearless with color. So really just get a look at this and imagine what this was saying about American democracy, American ingenuity, and our way of projecting our power to the world. Our power was not just military, but it was also creative. Perhaps a lesson that could be learned by our president-elect. Sorry, I had to say something. All right. So we had Tiffany sort of in a small world, focusing on the elite of New York City, and now on the elite of the American political world. And then he set out to conquer the American home. And he didn't do it necessarily through his interior design, he really did it through his art glass. And here's a perfect example of one of my favorite pieces from the Metropolitan Museum's collection. And I think that one of the things you brought me here for is to sort of show the process of innovation. And so the following slides are most of them from the Metropolitan's collection, and I'm going to run through them to give you a sense of how groundbreaking this glass was in the period. So this is iridescent glass, and Tiffany is widely credited with the invention of iridescent glass. There were other people, Johannes Lotz in Austria, who were doing it at the same time, Poschinger in Germany, but Tiffany, no doubt, was the one who codified it and I think made the greatest success with it. When they figured out how to do what's known as a peacock luster, which is what you see here, it was really off to the races. But that wasn't the only type of glass they were doing at the beginning. They were also doing things like this. Now this was part of the donation of H.O. Havmeyer to the Met in 1896 of 52 vases and roundels that Tiffany had created as a sort of complete collection for Havmeyer. And Havmeyer figured since he was Tiffany's best client, he was getting the best of his earliest production, and since he was a great patron of the museum, he was going to give it to the museum, and this was another way that Tiffany would disseminate his gospel of beauty to the American masses, because the Metropolitan Museum was then, as it is now, one of the great museums of the world. But take a look at this. This is kind of weird, right? It's sort of this psychedelic gourd. Now the gourd form is something you see in glass all the way back to antiquity, but Tiffany was updating it with his treatment of color, with his abstraction, and also with this iridescence. He took his influence as well from Italy. Now he called this his agate glass. Agate is a gemstone, but it's really vetri calcedonier, which is a Murano technique where you layer glass while it's being blown hot, and then you carve it back to reveal the layers that are underneath. So there's a precedent to everything in the world. One of the great precedents to Tiffany glass, of course, is Roman glass. And here we have a piece from the first half of the 1st century AD, also from the Met's collection. And then here we have a piece of Tiffany glass in the Metropolitan Museum from 1895. So it's sort of a fantastic, object lesson. Here we have the original, and then here we have the copy, except the copy was incredibly creative at the time. I love the use of swirled color, and again, the form might be kind of simple, but the decoration is not. Now, Tiffany had innovations in glass that people had never done before in history, and one of them is what we think of as his drip or lava technique. And this is a fantastic example of that. And I really believe that Tiffany, even though he did not consider himself a modernist, was at the forefront of the movement of abstraction in America. This vase was made before Georges Braque and Picasso started experimenting with Cubism. This was made before Jackson Pollock. But look at the two of them, you just cannot say that there was not an influence here. Jackson Pollock went to the Met. He's never been reported as having examined the Tiffany collection, but I'll be a monkey's uncle if it didn't influence him. Now, Tiffany, get back to the Metropolitan Collection. You'll also see things like this where they're using treatments of blocks of color, which is very hard to do in glass. Now back to the lava technique, this is probably the most famous piece in the Metropolitan Museum's collection because it has this real sense of the scorched earth that is left by lava when it flows over basaltic rock, and that's what you see here. But what were the influences of this? It's actually quite interesting because allegedly Tiffany took a trip to Mount Etna, saw lava flowing over basaltic rock, was inspired to make glass and did it. That may be true, but I think that it's actually a little different. Now we need to take a little step back in time. If you have been to the Met, you've seen the Cesnola collection. That's their collection of things from Cyprus, what they call the Cypriot collection. And Admiral de Cesnola, for those of you who are anti-immigration, this should maybe change your mind. Cesnola was an Italian immigrant, a high-end Italian immigrant, but one of the great heroes of the Civil War. He was a captain, I believe, in the Union Army. And Lincoln was so taken with him and so proud of him that after the war, he actually got our first ambassadorship to Cyprus. And he went there and embarked on a maniacal quest to do archaeological digs. And he brought back 20,000 objects that he donated to the Metropolitan Museum, which was then a nascent museum, and literally created out of whole cloth their whole antiquities collection. Now there are lots of disputes over the way that he did it and whether or not he should have taken everything, and that's something I'm not at liberty to discuss. It's really not my qualifications. But what he did was set up an ability for American eyes to see the world from a different perspective. So I think that has a lot to do with it because Tiffany actually called this type of glass in the center here his Cypriot glass. And how it was made is perhaps beyond the purview of this discussion, but the basic idea was it's the same as raku pottery in Japan. So we have something that's calling its influence lava, is probably influenced by antiquities from Cyprus, but the actual technique uses a oxygen-reducing formula where just like a Japanese ceramics. So I just think that's just fantastic how globalism plays into Tiffany's world. And while we're talking about Japan, for those of you who are experts in Japanese pottery, there's something called mended imari porcelain, where they would actually flow gold over areas of imperfection. And that, I believe, very strongly is part of what influenced Tiffany, because if you remember our first picture from Laurelton Hall, he was a great collector of things Japanese. So I think it's really fascinating. Now, I just showed you all this really weird and cool glass, but I think you have to have a historical context to understand what a member of America's elite would have considered art glass in the period. So this is a perfectly beautiful piece of American Victorian brilliant cut glass. Lead crystal is an innovation that goes back all the way to the Phoenicians. It's not something that was new in this period, but the ability to cut lead crystal in this way was something that was greatly influenced by the Industrial Revolution and electricity. So something like this type of a punch bowl, which is quite large, it was quite well made, would have been considered de rigueur if you were a wealthy New Yorker to have something like this in your home. Tiffany hated this. And his father sold this and he hated it. He just thought this had absolutely no artistic quality because for him, art was all about an interpretation of nature. And nature doesn't exist in a monochromatic vacuum. And that's what this was. He did not believe, as Marcel Duchamp did in 1912, that science could conquer art and that math and ratios could conquer beauty. He felt quite the opposite, that the whole goal of humanity was to see the imperfections and the beauty in art. And so it's just a completely different way of looking at things. And when we look at his Japanese influence, we see things like this, also from the Met. Now, in 1925, Tiffany loaned the Met 27 pieces of glass from his collection, which became part of the permanent collection in 1933. Now, Hafmeyer thought that he gave the very best pieces, of course, but Tiffany, having an extra 30 years to put things together, probably thought that his 27 pieces rounded out the collection. So it's kind of exciting when you go to the Met and you see everything they have. But I think it's interesting, again, to return to the Japanese and say, what is this vase and why did he make this? Because this is a vase that I think is really, well, they call it a paperweight, but it's not what you think of as like a Baccarat cliche paperweight. First of all, this is blown glass. This is not just done with lampwork and molding. And it's quite extraordinary because it shows Tiffany's love of color and his love of what I think of as a diffuse view of nature. And I really think that this is influenced by the ukiyo-e of Japan. So here we have one of the very famous images of Hokusai, Umegawa in Sagami Province from 1830s. Now we're stepping back in time almost 100 years. But I think this idea of a landscape of the mind, rather than a landscape that you could actually see in nature, like we did in the first painting from Cairo, was something that Tiffany loved. He loved this idea, if I can return to this for a second, of something that gives you a feeling of nature rather than the reality of nature. And I think that that is shown very clearly here in this fantastical landscape by Hokusai. Yes, that is Mount Fuji, but it's a completely flattened landscape. And so there's not really any representation of reality. I mean, these cranes would have to be 50 feet tall in order to look that large. So it's quite interesting. So I think if you'll permit me for a moment, I want to give you a sense of, in the world of Tiffany, what could be considered sort of good, better, best. And since we talked about Cypriot and lava, I'm going to just sort of run through a few photos to give you a sense of, in my limited point of view, what I think that means. So here's a vase that we had recently at Macklowe Gallery. As Kara mentioned, we've helped create lots of museum collections, and I'm hoping that this will eventually find its way from the private collection. It's into a museum. But what I love about this is this piece was sort of enormous. It was about 15 inches tall, which for a blown vase is really quite imposing. And remember when I mentioned the idea that Tiffany was at the forefront of abstraction, could this be any further from a piece of Victorian cut crystal? So what I like about this is the size. I love the mouth that is sort of asymmetrical. I like the abstraction of the decoration, this sort of scorched earth that you see in the Cypriot panels. And so I would call this a very, very good piece, and I was very proud to sell this. But one step above it is this. So let's look at this again. This is still a Cypriot vase, but here we have a whole rainbow of spectral colors. Here we see a bubbling surface. And if you remember, I mentioned the oxygen reduction technique in order to do this. What actually would happen is they would use, oh God, I'm forgetting, a substance in order that they would treat the surface with. And when it was done, when it was put into the annealing oven, it would actually come to the surface and cause this sort of bubbling quality to it. And I'm sorry, I've forgotten which bicarbonate of soda it is or whatever, but it's that basic idea. So what we have here is a more unusual form, very unusual color, and that makes to me this something that's beyond very good and maybe even to very, very, very good. But better still is this. So here your gasps say it all. Technologically extraordinary, shape is great, decoration is great, color is great, and so here you have something that's even a step higher, and this is in a private collection in Philadelphia that we recently sold it to. But just to return to the Met, to me this is better than all of them. So here we have color, we have form, we have crazy decoration, and so sort of as a recap, since we've been talking a lot about Tiffany glass, to me this is the best because it just shows all the risks that Tiffany was willing to take. And it's important to understand that by 1900, 43 museums around the world had an example of Tiffany glass. Now what I failed to mention at the beginning is Tiffany's first piece of artistic glass was made in 1892. So in 8 short years, thanks to pioneer collectors as well as gallery owners, Tiffany had this extraordinary reputation. Now, in Paris, there was Samuel Bing, who opened the gallery Art Nouveau, which is where the Art Nouveau movement gets its name from. He organized exhibitions, and the Musée des Arts Décoratifs in Paris bought Tiffany glass. Sorry, I have to read this. The Kunstgewerbe Museum in Berlin bought Tiffany glass. The Imperial Museum of Tokyo bought Tiffany glass. And so there was this extraordinary embrace of this contemporary artwork. But in 1900, does anyone know how many museums had a Tiffany lamp? 0. And so this was not yet something that was considered interesting to the museum hall. Now, in Tiffany's defense, the first 8 years was mostly glass production. Most of the lamps they made were for commissions like the Havmeyers. But well, in 1900, only 8% of New York City even had electricity. 92% of you didn't have electricity if you lived here 115 years ago. So to have a lamp that was purely decorative, because let's be honest, these are not lamps to read by, was an extraordinary extravagance. So the question we all ask ourselves is, where have all the good lamps gone? So fortunately, lots of them are at NetFlow Gallery, so I can give you some pictures to work with. So this is a Tiffany Peacock Lamp, and I think it continues with the theme of what we're talking about, which is Tiffany is trying to create these total works of art. Because here we have the idea of a peacock. There's no peacock head, there's no peacock face, there's no peacock neck, but nobody would look at this and think that it's anything but a lamp representing peacocks, because we have peacock feathers, we have the eyes of the peacock feathers, and then the body is suggested by the swollen chest of the base. And then at the very bottom you see the array of feathers around it in a symmetry of 6 that's done with mosaic glass. So it's really quite fantastic because it's not representation and it's not abstraction, but it's somewhere in the middle, what art critics would call conventionalization. It's taking the idea of it and sort of pulling it out of reality. And I think that's just fantastic. So we started in my family's business to have a great attraction for the Tiffany lamps when my parents started in the 1960s, but they really couldn't afford them at the time. So as their business evolved and they started to buy Tiffany lamps, it became a more and more important part of what we do. And we had lots of wonderful famous clients like Steven Spielberg and Rod Stewart and Barbara Streisand and all those people. And there was this extraordinary growth of excitement about Tiffany lamps in the 1970s. And interestingly enough, that's when the museums started to buy. So it sort of gets back to the comment. So I want to give you sort of an object lesson in how to look at a Tiffany lamp. If you went to a lecture given by a Renaissance art scholar, he or she would show you how to read a Renaissance painting to know what the portrait was trying to actually tell you without words. And I'm not that smart, but I'll try to give you the idea at least of how to look at a Tiffany lamp and understand what it is you're physically seeing. So let's stick with a peacock lamp, but let's go to a more conventional model here. So with a Tiffany lamp, since we're at the National Design Museum, I think it's important to talk about how they're made. Every 16-inch diameter Tiffany peacock shade is exactly the same. They're all composed of the same pattern, the same number of pieces of glass, and if you were completely colorblind, none of them would look any different to you. But that's what's beautiful about Tiffany, is that none of them are the same, based upon the color, based upon the treatment of glass. And what's interesting, and is again a topic for another lecture, is that most of the greatest Tiffany lamps that were designed by women, and the glass was selected by women. There were, as we've learned thanks to the New York Historical Society, about 25 women working with Clara Driscoll in the women's lamp and jewelry department who were responsible for some of the most famous designs. And Tiffany himself, there's two reasons that he hired lots of women, well, many reasons, but there's two that we know of for sure. One is that he got to pay them less because they weren't unionized. But the main reason is that he knew that women had a better color sense than men. Now everybody's nodding their heads like, well, of course we do. But think back to 1900, how many women artists were there showing in salons or galleries or museums? That was a radical and weird idea, but Tiffany saw it and he was right. And actually science has proven him right only in the last 5 years. That women actually, across the board, have a finer sense of color differentiation than men. And if you want any proof of that, just think for a second about anybody you know who's colorblind. It's almost always a guy. So, sorry, little tangent. Let's continue. So anyway, every single one will be, as I said, identical. Tiffany lamp bases and shades are often associated. When you have a lamp like this, it's only this way. This shade and this base were meant to go together. This shade and this base were associated by Tiffany. You had a choice of bases. So you don't always say, Tiffany lamp can't be right if it doesn't have this combination. You have to know a little bit more. But let's look at it from the top down. So this is just the cap. Now, one of these caps is real and one of these is fake. And I always love to do this with people, and usually you get it right. Okay, so I'd like a show of hands of everybody who thinks that this one here on stage left is the original Tiffany cap. Show of hands. How many people think it's true? You're going to have to raise your hand for one of them, otherwise I'm going to charge you. Okay, so a small minority, very good. And how many people think this one is the original one? Oh, the majority. See, that is why if you play Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, you always want to ask the audience. You're absolutely right. So let's see why. Think of Tiffany as sort of this anal retentive perfectionist when it comes to his industrial design. Every single Tiffany cap was etched out of acid rather than stamped in a die press, which was crazy and cost them way too much money. But Tiffany hated the idea, as you see here, that you'd sort of have these empty cells. If you look here, every single cell has an edge. And so that's it. Everything else is meaningless because nobody making fake Tiffany Caps is going to go to the trouble. So there you have it. Now you're as much of an expert as I am at Tiffany Caps. But let's look at the shade. Every single peacock lamp, as I said, is composed of a design based on what they called a cartoon. Now if you look here, you have a peacock eye here and a peacock eye here, and then it repeats here and here. So this lamp repeated all the way around the shade, this one in a symmetry of 8. Sometimes there's no repeat at all in certain lamps, sometimes there's a repeat in a pattern of 3. When you look at the shades, you'll see, generally speaking, that the leading is very thin and very, very expertly done. Much harder to do thin leading when you have a curve, because obviously if you look at anything that's curved, it's larger on one side than the other. So when you're flowing lead over something, you need more on the side where the hole is. So a geometric lamp that has all square tiles, everything should be just like a perfect little soldier. So continuing on, and we're going to review all this, don't worry, because there's going to be a test at the end, I hope you all realize. If you look at every single piece of glass here, a good Tiffany lamp, and almost every Tiffany lamp, there is nothing monochromatic. Now think back to that piece of cut crystal I showed you. Tiffany loathed the idea of single colors. And so he drove his glassmakers and his chemists absolutely mad, figuring out how to make glass that represented what his eyes saw in nature, what he was doing in his watercolor and oil paintings at the same time. And so they figured out how to make glass that had multiple hues, and when you see a good Tiffany lamp, every single cell should have a feeling of multiple colors, so that overall there's a composition that makes the eye move around it. And let's continue by looking at the base. Generally speaking, every Tiffany base, which is cast of bronze, is perfect. You know, with some bronze makers, they have a late cast, or a bad cast, or a lifetime cast, or no. With Tiffany, basically every piece of metalwork is perfect, which is extraordinary. Tiffany was creating metalwork for nearly 50 years. The Tiffany Studios was in business from 1898 until 1934. And you almost never see what you would call a poorly made piece of metalwork. That's something to be proud of. There was an extraordinary pride in the people who worked there. And Tiffany himself lived in New York City and on Laurelton Hall on Long Island, and his factory was in Corona, Queens. It was literally halfway between his two homes. So he was there all the time, driving everybody crazy. But that was part of the reason why the quality was so good. Now, looking a little bit more carefully at this base, let's look at the quality of the metalwork. Now this is a little bit hard for you to see here, but if you look carefully, you'll see again, there's multiple colors in this. And again, the influence of Japan comes here. I can actually show you a super close-up. So this is a super close-up of that base, and you can see there's no one color. This patina was made in the factory. This is not as a result of 100 years of life. And so what Tiffany wanted to do was actually figure out how to reverse engineer what the Japanese were doing. This is a Meiji bronze from the 19th century that has this multi-hued patina that Tiffany loved so much. Nobody in Europe had figured out how to do this, and Tiffany figured out how to reverse engineer it because the Japanese bronze makers weren't about to divulge their secrets. Tiffany couldn't pay anybody enough to divulge the secret, but they figured out how to do it with copper plating the bronze and introducing all sorts of pigments and acids and such to make it happen. Is everybody with me? Yeah. We having a good time? Okay, good. Just want to be sure, because I don't want to bore anybody. You know, no sleeping allowed. All right, so let's run through this sort of authenticity and quality checklist together. Let's start here with the cap. So every single cap will have an angled edge in each cell. There will be symmetrical cuts in the metal, and each of those cells will be finely finished with smooth walls. If you see something that looks very jagged, or if you see a straight up and down wall, you can be pretty certain that that's not something that was made at the Tiffany Studios. Now let's look at the shade. As I said, the pattern will be identical to known examples. It will repeat symmetrically and consistently, and the glass cuts must be consistent with metal templates. Now I haven't mentioned this. Keep that in your hopper. We're going to come back to that a little bit later. And generally speaking, the leading is uniform, and the glass is generally multi-hued. Okay? Now there are exceptions to every rule, but this is, you know, a 95 to 98% way of looking at a Tiffany lamp. And with the bases, the casting must be crisp and consistent. The detail work is often welded on after the casting, which I failed to mention to you. But what you see here, this onion ball, was done in the casting, but the wire that ran all the way up the base, which you can barely see here, was actually done afterwards. It was welded on because it was a better way of getting the specificity they wanted to. And as I said, the patina should have multiple tones like in Meiji bronzes. Now look, sometimes it's just hard to tell if something is authentic or not at Macklowe Gallery, and we really, really got stumped by this one. Thank you. Always gets on. So it's important to understand, obviously, there are Tiffany lamps and there are Tiffany lamps. Now, sometimes it is actually hard to tell because this is also a fake Tiffany lamp. Yeah. And this fooled the people at Sotheby's, too. Yeah, back in 1995, there was this landmark sale of a man named John Meekum who's from Texas, who was a great collector. But he bought this laburnum flower chandelier about 10, 15 years earlier, and when he put it in the catalog, we went and looked at it, and we told the people there we really didn't think it was right, and there were the 6 reasons why we didn't think so. They said it doesn't matter, it's right or wrong, and then the man who made it came along and said to them, I made that, you got to take that out of the sale. So you sort of have to think about provenance in the world of collecting as a double-edged sword, because really manufacturing is the most important thing. And we've seen it with the authentication of paintings, we've seen it with the authentication of jewelry, and certainly we see it with Tiffany as well. This is an entirely beautiful work of art, but it just does not happen to be original Tiffany. So, not the end of the world, but something worth mentioning. For those of you who are just, lusting after the idea of becoming collectors, it's important to know with whom you're dealing. So, this is a very pretty shade, and I think that it would be sort of an interesting way to, maybe if not conclude, certainly come close to concluding by showing you what I think are really great Tiffany lamps, the same way I showed you what I thought were really great Tiffany vases. So this is a Tiffany vase in the peony pattern, but it's actually called the elaborate peony. And now Tiffany himself, as I mentioned, had 570 acres of landscape gardens in his home at Laurelton Hall. He was a maniacal landscape architect and gardener. The one thing he was not a fan of was hybridization. He thought that you should get the flower that God made and make the best of it, with the exception of the elaborate peony. The elaborate peony had literally double the number of petals of a conventional peony, and he liked it so much that he made a lamp out of it. And remember I mentioned this whole idea of how the lamps are supposed to be made? Well, let's just take a little sidestep here, a little bit out of order. And this is what I was talking about when I was saying metal templates. Tiffany lamps were made, as I said, on a cartoon, and every single piece of glass in the pattern was numbered. You see here, this is number 98, this is number 12, etc. And these are the metal templates that would have been used to make something like this, which is a tulip pattern shade. This is the wooden form on which it would have been made. So when they were making this, they were actually working dark. They didn't have a light source coming through to make sure that the piece of glass that was up here was harmonious with the piece of glass that was down here. So it gives you a sense of just how expert the women and men who selected the glass really were. The way that they would make this is they would start with a cast ring at the top, and then they would take a group of pieces of flat glass, because all the glass in the lamps are flat. Every single piece of glass in this curvy, beautiful lamp is flat. And they would cut each piece of glass, imagining this is, on a flat piece. They would wrap it in copper foil on the edge, and then they would actually set it into this wooden form with a straight pin. And then when they had done a section of them, they would flow lead solder over it, and they'd sort of make their way down the lamp that way to a finished rim. And that's the 101 of how a Tiffany shade is made. Now imagine how hard it must have been to do this one. This is perhaps the most famous lamp that Tiffany ever created, the Wisteria, designed by Clara Driscoll, with an uneven top that shows the branchwork of Tiffany, and a beautiful tree pattern base. This is a lamp that only came this way. The shade and the base were a married unit. And I love the artistic idea of this. In the marketplace, a lamp like this is probably worth over $1 million. There are Tiffany lamps that cost exactly the same as this when they were made that are worth $200,000. They would have less intense colors. And so that's where the collecting market is sort of separated from the originality of Tiffany, in the sense that when Tiffany was in business, every single wisteria cost the same price. Unless it was a custom order where you said, well, I want purple and green because that's what I have, and if Tiffany liked it, he would make it for you. So we see here the extraordinary detail of how to give you the idea of a wisteria tree of the blossoms that are all pendant, the uneven bottom border, but it doesn't necessarily show you exactly how a wisteria would be. I love the idea of that, and I love it even more with this shade. So we recently had the good fortune to own this, and Clara Driscoll actually writes about the inspiration of making this. She was from Talmadge, Ohio, and there was a farm that she grew up in, and the farmer next door had a Primrose Garden. And so what you see down here is mosaic glass, just like Laurelton Hall's columns that I showed you at the beginning, just like the Park Avenue Armory's Fireplace that I showed you at the beginning, taking the same idea of Roman mosaics and updating it to a naturalistic motif. And that's exactly what she wanted to do here. She took the idea of the primrose, and then she just exploded it, because she said that every spring the butterflies would be all over the Primrose Garden. And so she took this idea and she created her own Gesamtkunstwerk, her own complete work of art. This is not a functional lamp. I mean, there are light bulbs in there, but I have to explain to you, the shade continues all the way down to here. And so to change a light bulb, you have to have the smallest hand on God's earth, I assure you. And it's very, very difficult. But what do we actually have here? What we really have is a sort of diffuse, impressionistic idea of beauty, and of the idea of this moment in time when the butterflies would be flittering across the landscape in this Primrose Garden. And to me, this is like the top of what Tiffany was trying to create. It's less than 1% of what you're going to see in the marketplace. It's less than 10% of what you'll see in any museum collection. But this was very much what he had his greatest passion for. He loved combining different things, and he did it again in this. So this is in the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, which has a fantastic collection. And here again, you have the idea of the peacock, but it combines all of Tiffany's great loves. It's a lamp, so it is ostensibly functional, but it is a blown glass peacock eye vase on an enameled bronze base with Tiffany glass scarabs across here, and then enameled peacock heads and necks to a blown glass shade at the top. So it's this sort of idea where Tiffany just was unafraid of doing everything together and making it all work. So to me, this is sort of as high as it gets in terms of creation. Now, when you're thinking about how Tiffany is used in today's world, there's a very wide variety. And I think what's interesting, we're always talking in the world of antiques about how to sort of encounter antiques with the contemporary world. So I'd like to take a moment and show you what that looks like. So this is a client's home, and he bought this beautiful Tiffany spider lamp, which unfortunately is not a great photo, but it's very, very pretty, where the base, which looks like the underside of a portobello mushroom, was born with the shade, and it was only done that way. But he has it juxtaposed with a Kenneth Nolan painting and a George Nakashima sideboard. And I think this is a way of showing what sort of heterogeneous collectors like about Tiffany, is that there are a lot of ways to use it. You could also imagine using something like this in a Tiffany interior. The influence here is medieval armor. It's a chainmail chandelier, but every single one of these is a single piece of glass set like a piece of jewelry in a little metal cage, and it's completely flexible. And so it literally would blow in the air. It's just amazing. And so people use things like this in modern interiors. Here we have the home of Reed Krakoff, formerly the head of Coach, and he used Tiffany chandeliers that he bought from us. And you could see how he did in what was otherwise a home completely not having 1900 furnishings or even 1900 architecture, but somehow it all works very well together. I mean, this is a John Dickinson table made in California in 1968. It's just as different as could be from what you think of as Tiffany, but it all has a way of working together. And I always believe that great goes with great. So here's something great. Also Tiffany. But instead of the Japanese influence, here we have the Chinese influence. Whereas the Japanese gave you the idea of something and gave you asymmetry, the Chinese give you just this extraordinary precision and symmetry. And here you see it. This is one of the only lamps by Tiffany that is not on a continuous plane. If you look at it, you can see it goes up and down and up and down and up and down and up and down, and does it all the way down the shade, which was a bitch to me. I love the attenuated quality of the base, the flattened quality of the shade, and this lamp is called the pagoda or mandarin for that reason. And you could imagine this going like in a Frank Lloyd Wright interior, couldn't you?
Yeah.
Well, it did. So this is Fallingwater, his famous home in rural Pennsylvania, done, of course, for the Kaufman family, and they were Tiffany collectors. And isn't it just great that with this sort of rustic, modern idea of architecture, with Japanese, with screen-inspired windows, with medieval, Madonna and Child, with an early Native American basket, with a colonial-era chair, everything goes together with the Tiffany lamp in the dead center to sort of harness it all. And to me, that's just great. I love the idea of that. And I think it's really important as we sort of go through this sort of modernization of the world that we live in, not to lose track of the idea that every period thought that they were modern. So here we have a home of music impresario Jimmy Iovine, who's not a collector per se, but he wanted to also bring some Tiffany ideas into his home. So he did a little Tiffany lotus bell lamp here, a non-Tiffany lamp here from the period, and some Tiffany candlesticks and such that sort of livens up an otherwise very straightforward interior. Now, we also could have something like this. This is a Tiffany Turtleback Chandelier that is very similar, in fact, to the one that you could see upstairs in the teak room. Now, how would you use this in a 1900 interior? You can see upstairs. How would you use this in a 2016 interior? Like this. So isn't this fascinating? An entirely white room with a really contemporary piece of art on the wall, with only a hint of crown molding, and yet here you have something where the Tiffany chandelier just justifies the whole room. And I think when you think of Tiffany as this aesthetic omnivore and as this fearless innovator, I hope that over the course of these last 51 minutes, you've gotten a sense that we have just scraped the surface of his creativity, and there is so much more to explore. So I hope that here at the Cooper Hewitt, at the Met, at my gallery, or any place else that you'd like to visit, that you explore this world, because Tiffany is an incredibly rich source of beauty in the American world and around the world. And I think that if you take the time to learn about it, you'll see that it can relate to your own personal aesthetics in some way or another, and could be a great source of joy for you. So that's my talk, and I thank you. I guess you guys liked it. For those of you who need to leave, feel free. For any of you who have any questions, we've got a few minutes. Yes?
Okay.
Hold on 1 second, speaking in the microphone.
Oh my God, it's so formal. Thank you, Ben. That was amazing. I'm not going to stand up. But you and other people use Tiffany, the studio, the store, as well as Louis Comfort Tiffany, almost interchangeably.
Sure.
And it'd be interesting to know exactly how you would characterize the man's contribution. Is he the artistic director, the creative director? Did he know these crafts intimately? Could he make a lamp himself?
Great question.
What is he?
Sure. Well, he's all of that. He was a good painter. He was not a craftsman. He did not know how to blow glass. He did not cut glass. He didn't know how to cast bronze. He knew how it was done, but he was not a workman. He was not a craftsman. He did not do those trades. His trade was beauty. And so a truly great artist can see something that's right in front of everybody else's eyes that they're blind to. And that was really Tiffany's great skill. He was a great aggregator of talent. He had very good people who worked for him. But there's no question that he did not sit there at the shop, cutting glass and doing all those things. Because of who he was, and because he was the sole proprietor of the Tiffany Studios, and he was, for a while, president of Tiffany and Company, and he was always on the board of directors, his name is always in the marquee. He never allowed his artists and artisans to get the kind of credit that somebody probably would today, and that people would insist of in this age of communication that we live now. So that was sort of par for the course at the time. Does that answer your question?
Yes, very much.
Okay, good. Thank you. Yes, anyone else? Yeah, in the front.
When and where are you speaking again?
You can check on my website, or I'll give you a card. Thank you, you're very kind. Anybody else?
What happened to the rooms at the White House that you designed?
That is a fantastic question, and I forgot to mention that. What happened to the rooms at the White House? Well, this, you have to know a little bit about New York political and social history. So, you've heard of Teddy Roosevelt, I assume. You know, he was governor of New York for many years. His family, as you probably know, since they have a historic home on Long Island, were near neighbors of the Tiffanys. And Mr. Roosevelt, when he was governor of New York, had a huge dispute with Louis Comfort Tiffany about public access to the beach at Oyster Bay. Because Tiffany owned 590 acres with an enormous frontage on Oyster Bay, and he didn't want the hoi polloi, looking in on his home and bothering him. So Teddy Roosevelt, he fought it out in the courts. Eventually, the state won, as the state always does, but Roosevelt never forgot the indignity that Tiffany visited upon him by making him take him to court. The first executive order that President Teddy Roosevelt did when he came into office was to destroy the 3 rooms that Tiffany had created. Created for President Chester Arthur in 1883, destroyed by Teddy Roosevelt 20 short years later. We don't know where any of them are. Isn't that sad? Anyway, that's the truth of it. Somebody in the back has a question.
First of all, thank you very much. That was
Oh,
great.
you're welcome.
Could you please tell us why they stopped and if reproductions have ever been made since 1930 something?
Sure. Why did they stop? Tastes changed. First of all, we had a little thing called the Great Depression starting in 1929, which stopped almost all luxury goods companies in their tracks. But Tiffany was an old man by then. He retired in 1919 and died in 1933, and the company sort of listed along from 1919 to 1934 without him, sort of redoing their old designs. But tastes had really changed. Remember, the Armory Show in 1912 made a very definitive stand about what art was supposed to be going forward, and it wasn't representational beauty of nature or even an abstract interpretation of nature. It was something very, very different. And so Tiffany fell greatly out of favor. And remember, there were people who just didn't like Tiffany at all when it was made. I mean, it wasn't for everybody, just like it's not for everybody today. So they stopped production. They went into bankruptcy in 1934, and 1933 rather. They went into liquidation in 1934. They had so much backed up stock produced. It took 3 years for Percy Joseph, who was the liquidator who had bought the entire stock, to sell it off. And every now and then we've had the good fortune to actually buy something from the Percy liquidation, and we'll have the original invoice. And even back then, in liquidation, it was unbelievably expensive. A vase like that Cypriot vase that I showed you at first, the big tall one that I said was a very good one, something like that would have been $85 in 1929, when a good job was paying you $2 a week. So it gives you a sense of just how extraordinarily expensive Tiffany was. So from 1934 until the late 60s, nothing happened. There was a revival of interest in Tiffany, largely due to a group of women, mostly Jewish women actually, in the New York area who fell in love with Tiffany and started dealing in it. Women like Lillian Nassau and Minna Rosenblatt, Alice Osowski, and Barbara Macklowe, my mother, who saw a beauty in Tiffany that other people didn't see. With the revival, the prices started to come up, and that's when reproductions started to get made. So once again, provenance, if you're trying to determine authenticity, has to go back a lot more than 50 years, because my parents did make the mistake of buying a reproduction Tiffany Dragonfly lamp in 1968. They realized their mistake when the man who had it made told them. And that's a long story for another day, but just goes back to showing that you have to be very careful with what you buy. I think we have time for one more question. Sure.
How many of these lamps were made? Were there runs of 100 or 1,000 or 10,000?
Great question. How many were made? The butterfly lamp that I showed you, which we're going to just go back to for 1 second so that you know which one I'm talking about, because it's so beautiful. There are 4. Most people think there are only 3, but I know where the 4th one is. Trying to buy it right now. That's about as rare as it gets. There are a couple that are only 2 or 3. There's maybe one that there's only 1. Then there are others like the Tiffany Dragonfly. There might be 150. But we don't know the exact number for 2 reasons. One, they didn't number them that way in a series. The lamps very often will have an inventory number for the style, like the 20-inch Dragonfly is style 1495, but they won't tell you how many of them there are. And unfortunately, in 1929, there was a devastating fire at the Tiffany Studios, which destroyed 95% of the archives. So museum curators around the country have spent the last 75, 80 years trying to resurrect the records that were lost at that time. Yeah.
But wouldn't it be additionally difficult to track the number because very few of the styles had a married base to reflector shade?
Okay, so the question is, wouldn't it be hard to track how many were made? Well, not if we had the original records, it'd be very easy. But it does bring up the point that there are shades. Any 20-inch diameter shade could go with a number of bases. Any 16-inch diameter shade could go with a number of smaller bases, etc. So your point is well made. We can only tell somebody who's interested in knowing this relative rarity. I know that the most common lamp Tiffany ever made was the 16-inch diameter acorn lamp, which is a mostly geometric lamp. And I know this because there are what are known as dash number lamps, where they do have the inventory number, then a dash, and then a number after that. And we always used to think that it was the ones that denoted high quality or ones that were special orders. And then Tiffany scholar Martin Eidelberg took me aside one day and said, Ben, I think I figured it out. And I said, what'd you do, Martin? He said, I looked through every auction catalog I own from 30 years to look for the highest number dash number lamp. And I got to number 88. So the inventory number dash 88, and do you know what it was for, Ben? It was for a green and white 16-inch acorn, which is the most common, uninteresting Tiffany lamp that was ever made. So, you know, we don't really know how many were made, but I can tell you for certainty that that's the one that was made more than any other. Any other questions, or are we good?
Question about the New York Historical
Okay,
Collection.
one more question, yes.
The
That's
New
okay.
York, the New York Historical Collection?
Yeah.
Where does that fall in the lexicon?
Sure. If I'd had more time, I could have talked about more public collections, but she asked about the New York Historical Society collection, which is a collection that basically was created by one person. There was a couple by the name of Egon and Hildegard Neustadt, who were pioneer collectors in the 50s and 60s. He was also a dealer in Tiffany, and he did something fantastic for the world of collectors. He gifted 50% of his collection to the New York Historical Society. He gifted about 20% of his collection to the Queens Museum of Art, since he was from Queens. Tiffany was made in Queens, and he thought they deserved something. And if you ever have the opportunity, I highly recommend visiting there. And then with the rest of it, he created the Hildegard and Egon Neustadt Museum of Tiffany Art, which travels. And so most recently, I lectured at Winterthur in Delaware, one of our national historic museums, and I lectured on Tiffany there because that's where the Neustadt collection was. But back to the Historical Society. Because it was Dr. Neustadt's collection, and they accepted it whole cloth, there is everything from just okay to extraordinary. And actually, I think that's kind of cool, because it really gives you a sense of this industrial manufacturing company, which is what they were, what was the range of what they did. Because they didn't really have a lower priced line. The lamps that were less elaborate cost less. So a 16-inch acorn might have been $45, whereas the butterfly lamp might have been $450. But they were made by the same people. They were cast of the same quality bronze. They were done with the same patina. So the Historical Society has worked very hard to sort of get a really good sense of the quality of their collection. And they're doing something extraordinary, which is that they are repurposing the fourth floor for a whole women in industry in New York circa 1900 exhibition. And the Tiffany room will be central to that. And that's going to be done in the next couple of years. And if you have any spare coin, I highly recommend you donate to them. That's after you've given all the money that Cooper Hewitt needs, obviously. But I highly recommend that. And then when it's open, it'll be really something worth visiting.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.